Should I grab any props? I think I'll grab the Grease Monkey graphic novel.
Yeah, get as much as you want. Sure. Love to. Right. And all right.
Ta-da!
All right. There we go. Looks good. And we are live. Tim Eldred.
Hello, Internet.
So how are things going on? Where are you calling from, Tim? Are you in California?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And aside from Grease Monkeys, what else? What are you working on right now? I know you're always busy, like because you've been in the you've been in the business for a long time. You've worked with Batman and Avengers and all these other properties. So I mean,
That's right. Well, I've been doing comics since 1992. No, 1989.
Mhm.
And I expanded into TV cartoons in 1996.
Yes.
Doing storyboards. And the two jobs are remarkably similar to each other. My comic book experience was perfect preparation for storyboarding experience. They cross over in a lot of important ways because they're both about telling stories visually with a sequence of images.
Yeah.
Obviously, the format is very different, and so the limitations and the advantages are different on either side.
Sure.
And I still do both simultaneously. I love being able to spend like half a day on one and then shift over to the other.
Sure.
And start to use different parts of the brain.
Yeah, sure. And then of course, you were doing it before it was cool. Like nowadays, like comic book adaptations are, if you don't have a comic book adaptation, you'd be surprised to even be working right now. But you were doing it in a time where, like the comic book and the TV world were still very much not separate, but not nascent. Like they're not. Obviously we had the '60s cartoons, the Super Friends and all that other stuff. But
sure,
I feel like the '90s, it was in the late '80s, early '90s was like a pivotal time because. I remember being a kid running home from school and I knew exactly what time X-Men was on. I knew exactly what time Batman was on. I knew exactly what time, all these shows were on. And of course, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I mean, so there was all these comic book adaptations, but in a lot of cases, especially the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which I want to revisit in a sec, because I want to talk about, of course, your new project, Grease Monkeys, is that, some people didn't have, we didn't have internet. So you didn't always know that there was a back end story or something that,
or some other media.
Yeah, that came before. You would have never known.
Well, there's a generational evolution to all of this.
Sure.
Comics and TV cartoons crossed over almost from the beginning. In the 60s, as you said, you could find any number of TV cartoons that were based on comic books. But what has happened since then is we've had kids grow up on those cartoons.
Yep.
And so the people who make cartoons now are the ones who grew up watching them, say, in the 80s and the 90s. And if you go back one generation, you had some of that, but not quite as much.
Yeah.
And the advantage of today's generation is that they also grew up on anime.
Right. Yes.
And so they've got a huge bag of tricks to bring to the battlefield.
Yes. And I can definitely tell you are decked out in 2202 posters all over your wall, which is awesome to see. I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, anime is, it's interesting. I feel like, as we're seeing like increased representation in animation today, I always felt like, Black America's influences in animation have always been stronger in anime than they have in, like The Simpsons or anything like that. I've never met really many black kids grow up on The Simpsons. It's always Dragon Ball Z. It's always those type of franchises that, especially Cowboy Bebop was a huge one. And then they come in and they do, and you could see their work everywhere. I mean, LaShawn Thomas comes to mind, and yeah, it's just it's interesting seeing all these different art styles mesh. And then nowadays, when you do see an animated series, more so an adult animated series where it's considered a drama, it's almost de facto to call it anime now, even if it was made in Texas or Canada or something to that effect, which is interesting.
Yeah, interesting. I'm not sure it's an entirely positive thing
Right,
because
I agree.
I tuned into it in the 80s, and to me, there was a very thick wall between TV cartoons made in America and anime made in Japan.
Yes.
One of them was specifically anime, and that's what you called it.
Mhm.
And we didn't allow that word to cross through the wall,
Yeah.
um, because at the time it had a very specific meaning.
Yes.
And we've seen that meaning start to get blurred in recent years. We
Yeah.
have Netflix saying that they're doing anime now.
Yes.
And even if there's not a single Japanese person on the creative staff,
Exactly.
they're still calling it that.
Yes.
And
Which is interesting.
I'm
And
not
I think
sure
it
I'm
actually
behind
hurts.
that.
I actually think it hurts the show because like we covered last month. We covered a series called the Idhu Chronicles, which is actually made in Spain, but
Mhm.
they kept calling it an anime. And so if you're somebody who's been watching anime, you may not have found a lot in that. But if you are somebody with a Spanish background that kind of wanted something for you, calling it anime, I think was a mistake because it had kids thinking, it had kids think, one, it helps you build that built-in audience when you're marketing it. If they were to come to market with that series and say, hey, this is a Spanish produced series as opposed to an anime series, I think they would have had more viewers, and then ultimately got canceled. And I think they're running into more and more of that because they're bringing in series from, I mean, don't you dare call animation from China anime. I mean, they don't like that word in China. So I mean,
So
yeah,
you
you're
thinking we
right.
should call it Spanime?
Spanime. Well, that's what they did with American anime. American produced anime too, is the American anime, the Rubies and those series. So
Well, I can understand the urge to move past the word cartoon because
yes,
it's still, it's a perfectly good word, but it does
yeah,
have a more childish connotation to it because
right.
of our evolution. But um, I think going to anime is sort of like co-opting somebody else's cool
Mm-hmm.
instead of developing your own.
Yes,
And it seems like the term everyone is settling on for the moment is adult animation,
right.
which can be problematic, in another way, because
Sure.
adult usually means something
Trust
else.
me, we
But
have to go through that conversation all the time.
yeah,
Because that's what we are. We're an adult animation magazine,
right,
and we do have to, kind of really the way I reinforce adult animation is I say prime time and adult animation. So at the very least, we're talking about stuff that airs at 10 o'clock, not stuff that's on
yeah,
the internet at 2 a.m.
yeah. Ideally, though, if you want a buzzword, you don't keep adding words to it. You take words
Yes,
away.
you're
So
right. And it's the growing thing that we're trying to still, and that's why we get very specific with what our coverage is, and even to a fault. I mean, I've turned down. I know you've been working with Mike over at OpenGate, and I'll say, hey, look, this one isn't really for us, because this is kind of a little more kid friendly, and that's not really us. And it really is two different departments when you're talking about when you're pitching and stuff like that. It's two different people now, and to the point where they have people under those people, like whole departments. Just all you're doing is adult animation today, and it's really one side of the office is here and one side of the office is there, and getting a point with one doesn't mean you're getting the point with the other. So that's why I like kind of specifying moreover what's the targeted age group for your series, so that you know where to go when you're walking down the hallway is the best way to really
sure.
kind of say it. Obviously now it's changed since when I was a kid. Batman the animated series, and Batman used to beat the crap out of the Joker, and he would take blood, he would do all this other stuff, and that used to air at 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Mhm.
Nowadays, it's a little different. It's first of all that you don't have any animation on any of the broadcast networks for kids, for younger groups anyway. And now that we're in an era of streaming services, it's getting to the point where, where's the line? And there's really no, I don't know if there's really, it's almost up to the streamers or the networks in a sense to kind of be more subjective, I guess, nowadays, because there's no way somebody at the FCC is watching all this and saying, oh yeah, this gets this.
Sure. Well, the FCC's influence ends where public broadcasting facilities end. I mean, they have no say over cable or streaming.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're fully aware of that.
Sure.
Back in the old days, sometimes that was good, sometimes that was bad, because we've all heard stories about what happened to the toy market crossing over with Saturday morning cartoons back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both suffered from that crossover.
Mm-hmm.
It was necessary for financial reasons, because it took a lot of money to get a cartoon show going. So if you had a deal with a toy company, then that could help to propel you forward. But then that created this gray area where the cartoon became a commercial.
Yep.
And the FCC definitely had things to say about that.
Yep. Yep. And all about that, because I mean, the Ghostbusters was a popular toy. I had every Ghostbusters toy, and I had every Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, and that was advertised to me from those cartoons. I wanted to be just like Leonardo and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So all my Christmas lists were every Ninja Turtle and every villain.
Yeah, but now we aren't really seeing that. No. Even though the shackles of the FCC have been removed by cable and streaming, I don't see the same level of merchandising that used to exist in cartoons.
Yeah, it almost stops at gaming, doesn't it? Nowadays, like you'll see games, but that's it. Like you won't really see, I mean, obviously you got your kid robot and your pop toys. Those are out there, but you're right. It's not as big of a, it's not as big of a mandate. I mean, and in fairness, where are you going to buy these toys nowadays anyway? There is no more Toys R Us. So it's Amazon or nothing. And if you're not on there, you're out of luck. And so when you used to work on some of these franchises that had prior IP, does that become handcuffing? Like when you're making Ghostbusters, are you having to follow the certain rules of OG Ghostbusters? And when you're working on the Avengers or Batman, are you constructed to follow along with the paradigms that are set in place?
Well, of course, everything you work on, whether it has previous IP or not, is going to have its own world and its own set of world rules. Mm-hmm. What makes the larger IPs easier to handle is because they've been around forever, and if you grew up on them, then you kind of know going in what those rules are going to be, and you're happy to work within them. So it's never felt restrictive to me. Mm-hmm. The one time I can recall it being that way was on a show called Heavy Gear. Mm-hmm. That was a CG series that went through the Sony Animation Studio back in the early aughts. Mm-hmm. And it was originally intended to be much bigger than it ended up being. Mm-hmm. The scope of the story was going to start small and then get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And after we delivered the first 13 episodes, the sponsor of the show, who was handling the syndication, said, "Nah, let's not bother making it bigger. Just stay in this little bubble that we created in the first 13 and don't go past that." And so for the rest of the show, it was kind of like we were just spinning our wheels and getting nowhere.
Sure.
But that came directly from the people who were in charge of the show.
Yeah.
Occasionally on a Marvel show, and I've worked on a lot of different Marvel shows, we will try things in a storyboard, like adding something to a character's power set or giving them some sort of a move that we've never seen before, just because it could be cool to try something new.
Sure.
And once in a while, that'll get batted back to us from the head office saying, no, he can't do that. No.
Any examples? Any examples you're allowed to share?
Yeah, I had an Adventures episode with Winter Soldier.
Okay.
And he was fighting Black Panther, and I thought it would be cool if he could do some more stuff with his cybernetic arm.
Sure.
Like I was going to have it open up and have some stuff come out of it and give it some extension power.
Sure.
And they said, no, we don't want to go there. We're complicating it. We're adding more stuff than we want to, So there was that. There were a few times where we had Ms. Marvel in an episode, and you're probably aware she can grow larger and shrink smaller.
Yes.
And so there were a couple of times when we went back and forth on how high can she grow before it's past what we've seen in the comics.
Sure.
So sometimes you don't know where those landmines are until you trip one. But it's just part of the process.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. The network notes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Rest in peace to the network notes.
Very seldom do we get stuff that we really want to fight against or we flatly disagree with.
Sure. At the end of the day, you got to go to work. You got to do a job. So when you're developing your own IP, like Grease Monkeys, what are you pulling from? And then like when you're working on something that's a little more independent, it's yours, it's your brain. What does that do for you in terms of the shackles that you may have experienced in the past? And then where, do you think it's, of the, do you think it seems like this year is probably a little more into a slightly older audience? I'm getting the jive of when I'm reading about it. So where are you? So is it like freeing to do something that's outside
this, right?
That guy right there, Grease Monkey, Tim Eldred, go get it, guys.
That's right.
Yes.
It's not. I don't think it's still in print, but you can find copies in libraries or.
Okay. There you go. Educational reading. But so I mean, when you're pulling from your own IP, is that obviously that's got to be more freeing, right?
Well, every story starts a little differently. There's a germ of an idea that pops into my head, and it'll grow there for a while, and then I'll start writing things down, and then as the ideas expand, they lead to other ideas and others and others and others. And inevitably, you're going to get to a point where you want to streamline everything. And so some ideas don't survive the streamlining process because you're always leaning one way or the other. You've got a whole bunch of ideas, kind of random and scattered. And if you like 10 of them, but you also like another 2 or 3 of them that conflict with those 10, you got to decide which group do I like better. If it's easier to keep the 10 and drop the 2 or 3, even though I like them, then the story's going to come together better, easier, better, faster, whatever.
Sure.
So inevitably you find yourself leaning one way or the other.
Sure.
I like this set of rules enough to throw away that set of rules. And then after a gestation period that sometimes could take years, you find your own playground, or a sandbox, whatever you want to call it. And so a lot of those rules are tied down to the ground when you start writing and drawing, because until that point, nothing has a shape, nothing has a specific appearance. But as soon as you draw a character, for example, and decide, all right, that's exactly what this character should look like, then certain variations of that character are off the field.
Sure.
And that's the process for every single idea that informs what you're doing. Some of those ideas may have been inspired from other sources. Like, for example, you may have watched a TV show when you were a kid. Let's say a TV show, I'll just make up a name, Battlestar Galactica.
Yes, of course.
And you remember one really cool episode where a second Battlestar came in and suddenly you had 2 of them. But then at the end of that episode, that second Battlestar was wiped out and you never saw it again. You thought it would be so cool if they both stayed there for the rest of the show.
Yes.
Well, when let's say you grow up a bit, and a few years later, you find yourself writing a story about, let's say, a giant robot. And you think it would be cool to bring in a second giant robot and then keep them both in the story.
Yes.
I did that. So it gives you chances to go back to things that were not satisfying to you in an earlier phase of your creative life,
Yeah.
and preserve those ideas and play them out the way you wish they had originally.
Sure. It's funny you mentioned like a bigger, you have Spaceship Yamano and back you. Those episodes were a lot of that. It was the Yamano seemed to be an indestructible ship, but for some reason a bigger ship came along. But you still kept rooting for Yamano, and then they built this whole mystical element around it, like, this ship is almost magical and can't die, and that's why it saves us in the end, and make sure Earth is repaired and all this other stuff. So it's interesting you bring that up, because that's what the premise of that series was.
Yeah, incidentally, the scenario I just played out for you with two giant robots was in the very first original comic book that I ever had published.
Mm-hmm.
It came out from Eternity, and it was called Broid.
That's right.
And it came out in the early '90s and crashed right into the marketing issues that happened back then.
Sure.
Comics were kind of a chaos market. Yes. During that time. So it was one of the many, many casualties. Mm-hmm. And so recently I opened up a brand new website, which is my personal archive. It's at timeldred.com. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things I'm doing is representing that entire comic book, Broid, issue by issue, the way it was originally meant to be seen. And so this is just a small preview of one of the things you can find over there.
That's awesome. And of course, now I think everyone's, it's a different time with the internet than the early 90s, but people do forget, like, until literally like 99 to 2000, like, comic books were, Marvel was filing, for bankruptcy, and a lot of these companies weren't doing well. And, it really took a wing to really kind of save in early 2000s, and that's where I think the movies kind of helped, and kind of bring a fervor, very passionate audience that extended to your Comic Cons and stuff like that. And at Comic Cons, you go through Artist Alley, and you're constantly finding new artists and whatnot to kind of learn from. So it's interesting to see, to kind of have been through that, and that probably better than a lot of people in terms of what that experience has been like, the ups and the downs.
Well, I first started going to Comic Cons in the mid '80s. Mm-hmm. Back then I lived in Michigan, and the closest really big one was the Chicago Comic Con, which mm-hmm. I don't think is going on anymore. But back then it was the closest I could get to San Diego. Mm-hmm. And year after year I would go, and I would take the artwork that I had done over the previous months and show it around to editors. And from the time I started that process to the time I actually got an assignment for the first time was about 5-6 years. I'd go and I'd show my work and think, this is the year I'm going to get a break.
Yes.
I'm going to walk away with a comic book assignment. Sure. Year after year, it never happened. I would show the work to an editor, and they'd say, looks good, but you got to do this, that, and the other thing.
Yeah.
And my immediate thought was, okay, I'll do this, that, and the other thing. Then can I get a job from you? But it was never, that's never how it worked.
Yes.
Because you have to develop all these things yourself, and you have to learn on your own, and you have to find your own way to who you're going to be, mm-hmm. instead of just taking commands, as if you're working in a restaurant, yes. Add more salt, add more sugar. You've got to adapt on your own. Mm-hmm. And that's a long process that can take years. Sometimes it can take decades. But finally, there was a year when I brought some samples with me. Mm-hmm. In fact, it was the comic that I talked about before, Broid. Mm-hmm. And I showed him to an editor at Eternity. And it was the timing that worked for me, because they had just gotten the license to do an adaptation of an anime series called Lensman.
Oh, okay.
And looked through my work and he said, we might be able to use this, but I'll tell you what, we just landed this license and it looks like something you could do. Would you be interested? And I said, sure.
Yeah.
So I didn't walk away with a job, but I walked away with an offer to try out for a job,
Yes.
which was the very best thing you could get at that time.
Yes. Yeah.
So in the space of a couple of weeks, I sent them a Lensman sample, and they said, "All right, you're the guy."
That's amazing. And have you found? It's funny. I just watched a masterclass from Neil Gaiman, and he was talking about how everybody has their own way in which to script a comic book. His skill set isn't in drawing, so what he would do is he would kind of print copies of, take a couple pieces of paper, staple them together, and maybe scribble some drawings, and then from there kind of develop his script. But he was talking about how everybody has their own way of doing it. It seems like every single person has their own way of doing a comic script. How do you feel was the way that you kind of learned to develop that skill set for you when you were starting to develop both your own IP, but also maybe being able to throw in some ideas for storyboards and whatnot?
Well, comic scripting and storyboard scripting are very similar in that you are describing something that's going to happen visually. But the outcome is, of course, going to be very different because in comics, what you have is a series of montages. Each page is going to be a montage of images. And you see that entire montage all at once. I mean, even before you focus in on a single panel, you're going to see a whole page. And so the information that's communicated on that page needs to be contained so you don't give too much away. So you do things like manipulate the page turns. If you want to save a surprise, you put it on the other side of a page turn so it'll pop out at a reader, right? With a TV cartoon script, you're dealing with different method of timing where things are happening in a linear fashion. You're only seeing one image at a time. The size of the montage never changes. It's just a screen. And so whereas the descriptive language of these scripts is almost the same, the way the information is conveyed visually is going to be very different. And so you want to plot out how that happens. Now, just speaking from my own experience, I started out drawing comics as a kid when I was maybe 10 years old, and grabbed from all the stuff that I loved at the time. Godzilla, G.I. Joe, Star Trek, various things, toys that I liked. Eventually, that when Star Wars came out, man, I was the Star Wars kid. I did Star Wars comics for myself because, it took too long for the movies to come out. I want more Star Wars right now.
Sure.
But at the time, I didn't know anything about the production process for comics. I didn't really even know that they had a script. And so I never wrote one. I just made these up one picture at a time. And as the story ideas came to me, from page to page to page, that's what I would draw. And after a few years of that, I sort of stepped back from it and realized, wait a minute, if I plan these stories out before I start drawing, maybe they'll be better. As my drawing skills were improving, I wanted my writing skills to improve too. And so I started spending more time on the pre-drawing phase, jotting down ideas and going through the process that I described earlier. Now I fully script every comic book before I draw it. I try not to go too far in advance because that kind of spoils everything, makes it less fun to, make discoveries later on. So there's a certain amount of information that you want to nail down right away. And then there's other stuff that you like to leave kind of vague. So you'll get to it eventually, but you don't have to tie it down right now. Once or twice I've gone against that rule by scripting a whole bunch of things out in advance, but then I found that it was less fun to draw because there was nothing to discover.
Mhm.
You know, all of the discovery phase was over.
Yeah.
And now it was just solidifying it into drawings. And so that was a valuable lesson too.
Sure.
You know, this is a beast that changes color and shape for everybody who approaches it. And that's
Sure.
what keeps it interesting.
Yeah, and I would think the same for animation too, right? I mean, obviously with the introduction of CG, I don't know how that has influenced, the back end, but I would have to imagine there's some things you can, I would think there are some bigger ideas out there, but then I wonder myself, how do you tie in then storyboards to CG? A lot of time they don't even, from what I hear, they sometimes don't storyboard CG. They just kind of, run it and see what happens and go from there. Just do some back drawings.
And I hear that some of the Star Wars cartoons are done without storyboarding,
Yeah,
which makes me itchy. I cannot imagine that how that's done.
yeah,
But to be more specific, CG creates a lot of limitations that do not exist in hand-drawn cartoons. They open up a lot of other opportunities that you don't have. You know, you can show things with a lot more depth. You don't have to employ a whole army of people to draw things for you, which is good. On the other hand, the CG world is really one of illusions, where you don't have any solid objects. And so if one object bumps into another, they overlap and they merge into each other. There are a zillion other limitations you have to observe, but this is the easiest one to describe, so that's what I'm going with.
yeah,
So you then have to stage things in a way that you would, say, for a live theater production.
sure.
Whereas you can punch somebody in a 2D drawing and show the contact.
Yep.
In CG, you've got to do this instead.
Yep.
Just like you would if you had actors on a stage. And so that's the closest thing I can compare it to.
Yeah.
And that's just one very tiny example, but you have to keep that in mind all the time. When I work on a CG show, I've got to remember that these are not going to be drawings. These are going to be like 3D ghosts, and you've got to set up your camera in exactly the right position to communicate what they're doing without giving away the fact that they're just ghosts.
Sure.
And so then you've got to work backward from things like that when you're in the writing process. And you have to be aware that at the end of all this stuff you produce, there's going to be a funnel where all of the information gets pushed in, and then it has to come out one tiny little spout at the end, one frame at a time. And the more you push into that funnel, the longer it's going to take to process all that stuff and just make these little frames.
Yep.
And so you've got to avoid really big crowd scenes, for one example. Anytime you've got a character moving, that's information that has to be processed in a computer. And so we always try to limit the number of people you can see in any given frame. But inevitably, there are going to be crowd scenes where you've got to have crowds and you've got to have a lot of people in one place. And so then you come up with ways to conceal the fact that they're not real. So it's constantly evolving. It's fascinating once you're inside of it and you get past the frustration of saying, no, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. So it's just like with any new medium that I've gotten into, whether it's comics or TV cartoons or game illustration or whatever, every medium is going to have its own limits and its own advantages. And so what you really need to do is make yourself adaptable so that you can phase into a different scenario and find what its strengths are and not be pulled down by its weaknesses.
Sure. And one thing that comes to mind is the way comics are made nowadays. It used to be, pen and paper, literally. Now it's, a lot of it could be digitally, created. And in terms of even selling comics nowadays, it's a little bit different. I mean, as long as you kind of get on like a Comixology, You know, you could probably get by, have your own website, go on Instagram, post up your cover, you know, raise Kickstarters. A lot of these Marvel comic book guys, you know, they go in, they get kind of famous on a Marvel. I'm thinking of guys like Don and Cates and those type, and then they do a Kickstarter on their own project. They get a couple $100,000 for that project, and well, now they got a whole IP for their own that they can work on almost exclusively, and see if they can't, you know, pitch it for, you know, like a small screen later on. But that's always been that's interesting to me too, like just how the industry of comics has changed, where, you know, you sometimes have to think to yourself, how important are, you know, in the night, you know, this, I mean, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you had inkers and you had, you know, pencilers, and you had all these other different jobs, and you have to ask yourself, well, how important are those, how incremental and important are those jobs are in today's environment, when I can easily just do something as highlight and bold, for example, or highlight and capitalize, whereas it used to be, you know, there, you know, if you read the Sandman, you know, and the art that was put into those letterings and whatnot, that, you know, won all those awards, you know, you're astonished by it. But I'm wondering if those nuances start to come out as it becomes easier to kind of produce over time.
I think it depends on what drives you as a creator. If you are driven to make the best comics you can possibly make, you're going to find a way to do that, whether there's money in it or not. If you're driven by the money part, where you think comic books make money, I could make a comic book. If your end goal is money, you're not going to produce something that's going to last,
right?
Because it has to come from the heart.
Yep.
Speaking for myself, I gave up on paper quite a while ago. Because when you take on paper, you take on a whole chain of commerce that instantly locks you down into, you know, a very predictable set of circumstances. For example, you've got to pay for the paper. You've got to pay for the ink that goes on the paper. You've got to pay for the binding. You've got to pay for the storage. You've got to pay for shipping. If it goes to a store, you're going to lose half your profits to the store owner. And this doesn't even take into account the cost of making the thing that goes on the paper. And so for me, paper has always been my nemesis. Because editorially, somebody has to decide, if I put your idea on paper, is it going to make enough money for me to pay for that paper? You know, and all the things that go with that paper. And 9 times out of 10, that answer is going to be no, because they can't guarantee it. And that's why you see a lot of stuff that's derivative, or that looks like it was calculated for the highest amount of money based on things that came before it. And so after beating my head against the paper demon for years and years, I finally decided, you know, it's more important to me to make comics than it is to deal with this commerce problem. Fortunately, I've got a job in TV production, which pays pretty well. So maybe I don't have to make any money on comics. Maybe I can just make comics, and the internet is there to help me bypass the entire paper chain. And so I'll just make comics for the internet. So Grease Monkey started as paper, you know, and I love having this book. I love everything about it. But when it came time to make a second book, things were not amenable. You know, the publishing world was kind of in collapse. And so no matter how badly I wanted to make a second book, no publisher was going to put it on paper. But then I thought, okay, internet. I'll just draw it because I love drawing it. And then I'll put it online for free, and anybody who wants to read it can go read it for free. And that led to my first website, which is greasemonkeybook.com, where you can see all of this book, all of the second book, and then all of the subsequent books that I still have to do. A few years after that, I created a new webcomic again, completely for free, called Pittsburgh.
Mm.
And that's spelled
Yes.
Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh. You can find it at pittsburgh.com. And this one did not start out on paper. I wanted to explore what could really be done online with webcomics, where you don't have to put everything in that montage that I was talking about earlier. And so I decided this is going to be an infinite canvas webcomic where I can go and go and go and go and go. And then, you know, as I said before, you've put yourself into a new creative space. Your job is then to adapt to it and find out what its strengths are. And what I found with Pittsburgh was that the act of scrolling creates a very different interactive experience than flipping a page.
Sure.
And so once I started exploring that and finding the things you could do with a scrolling comic, boy, did that take off. I found so many new tricks. And every time I discovered a new one, it was like, Eureka! I can do this now. I could never do this on paper. Like a long panel that if you were to print it out would be 6 feet, you know, on a scroll. You could never do that on a paper comic. And I love it so much that I can't see myself ever going back to paper now.
Sure. And then of course, I mean, with the epidemic from last year, you're having to adapt to additional technologies on top of, you know, the ones you already know. So I'm sure things like, you know, some of the meetings that you used to do back, you know, when there were used to be in offices that aren't in offices as much nowadays. What has that been like for you? And what has the last year been like for you? And then do you think some things are just things of the past, you know, because of the increase in technology now, because of how like I feel like I can find, you know, I can right now post a job listing and find you know, a pencil, you know, someone to draw anywhere in the country, and in theory create a room that's completely virtual and create something from that, and not have to worry about just getting everybody from LA or everybody from New York.
Sure. Well, that existed before the pandemic.
Sure.
So comics were already ahead of the curve as far as that went.
Yes.
Since you can create comics digitally and you can pass computer files around at lightning speed, you know, artists figured that out quite a while ago. But it had a huge impact on how you make TV cartoons. And it led to a point that I think a lot of studios were uncomfortable with in concept, which was we can no longer have people actually come into an office and work on our computer server here. That was always frowned upon because, or I mean, not coming into an office, working remotely was always frowned upon, because then you need remote access to a server with IP on it. And everyone was scared to death that that was going to be hacked. Because, and with good reason, because things like that have happened in the past.
Leak, sure.
Right. And so when it became obvious last February and March that the studio system was no longer going to work, and the only way to continue producing TV cartoons was to allow remote access, they finally got past their fear, because, you know, the need to make product was stronger than that fear. And they sent us home with our workstations, and we still had remote access and we could still do our jobs. The only thing that we missed really was having the ability to meet in person. Creative meetings were always really important.
Sure.
It's great for your esprit de corps to have everybody in a room all at the same time talking about the next episode we're going to work on together. But since we're accustomed to working with freelancers, sometimes over very long distances, we already had a precedent that allowed us to dispense with the meetings and talk to people remotely. And so really, TV cartoons thrived in the pandemic environment, and everyone working from home in ways that were not available to live action productions.
Yep.
We don't have to worry about getting actors on a set and having them work closely with each other,
Yes.
because our actors are all in voice form
Yes.
and drawn. And so we do miss having the ability to interact with other human beings on demand. But we found enough things to substitute. And again, we found the strengths rather than being pulled down by the weaknesses. And as a result, animation is thriving. It's, I think, the one part of the entertainment industry that actually benefited from COVID.
Yeah.
If that's even possible. And
Yeah.
I putting it that way.
And of course, in adult animation, we've seen an uptick because, it's we've had examples of shows that used to be live action and turned to animation or did an animated special or something like that effect, and it's because of what you said. It's just it's an industry that's ready made almost for today's technological environment. Whereas, as you mentioned, live action isn't there yet. And of course, there's all the. I mean, I was at a studio 2 weeks ago, because we're developing some stuff, and there's costs for COVID now. It's you have to pay for everyone's tests that are on the crew that you want to use and stuff like that. And so that's only going to make costs increase already on budgets that are getting smaller and smaller, and they were getting smaller even before COVID. Tim, I mean, especially those cable budgets. I mean, those are microscopic nowadays, than what they used to be. It's the direction of streaming. Everyone's got a new streaming service coming out every quarter. So it's interesting being in this, in this industry and being in this time of living through this, and then watching the adaptations happen, and then the fruits of what's coming out of it. I mean, on one hand, you're right, you lose that spontaneity with your crew, but for creators who don't like bosses about their own content, and there are those out there. I'm sure a few. I mean, there are people out there that just don't want a boss for their own content. It's theirs. They're going to do it their way. It's now's the time. Now's the time.
Yep, it all depends on whether or not you want to make money. The more independent you are, the less likely you are to have dollars at your disposal.
Sure.
But then you just have to decide what really matters. Is it the money or is it the creative opportunities? And for me, money has always been number two.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I consider myself extremely lucky to have an income that's generous enough to allow me to put money into my independent projects, mm-hmm. and not have to worry about them, paying for themselves.
Sure.
Because once you put that rule on everything, it trumps all the other rules. Mm-hmm. If it has to pay for itself, that immediately narrows the channel that you can walk through. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's going to narrow what you can do creatively. And I just, I don't like those limitations. So sure. I think I'll be making webcomics even when the pandemic is a distant memory. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's all about just the love of creating something.
Yeah, and great segue, Tim. I mean, for the upcoming year, what do you see coming from you? I mean, in terms of, do you have ideas for new IP that you're developing for both comics and TV?
The hard part is which one am I going to pull out of the vault and finally do next? So I have been developing an idea over the past several months. I finished Pittsburgh last fall in October and decided, okay, this is the next idea I'm going to do. It's something I actually came up with about 20 years ago, and I wasn't able to expand on it until recently and find ways to make it the best possible version of itself. So that will probably debut closer to the end of this year. But in the meantime, I'm still working on TV cartoons. I can't tell you what they are because, NDAs. But I guarantee you're going to hear about them when they come out because they're pretty big. And I just launched timeldred.com as an archive where I can start to pull out all the stuff that I've been storing for the last 40 years, including stuff that I drew when I was 12. And in fact, we're recording on February 5, and the next update is going to go live tomorrow. So I hope everybody will check that out. And from there, you'll find a link to my Grease Monkey website and to Pittsburgh and other things to come in the future.
Yeah, give us one more time, Tim, before I let you go. The pitch to your website. Where can everybody find all this that you're working on?
It's Tim Eldred, TIMELDRED.com.
Excellent. So Tim, what I'll do is I'll make sure to post something in the bio when this gets when this goes on demand, and then I'll let you go, Tim. But I hope to talk to you again soon, and hopefully you can tell us a little more about the projects that you're not allowed to talk about now.
Yeah, well, I'll be in big trouble if I start talking about my TV projects.
Oh, of course.
They will no longer be my projects.
Yes. Well, like when they start coming in fast, Tim, give us a call. We'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, we sure will.
All right, Tim. Well, thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of the day, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, John.
Take care.
You too.